And we're back, amazingly so. All right, so anyway, just to say once again, just to wrap the topic or wind the topic down here, there's no way on earth that we should not be having a full conversation about best ways in order to augment local democracy by having a healthy environment of objective information, which can also involve subjective information. Every newspaper that's ever been probably had an editorial page, you know, but, community voices, and I mean the whole community, all right? I mean, if you have, a group of people out of 02138 say, well, we're going to try and bail out one entity here, that doesn't necessarily bring in voices from, East Cambridge or from the port or up at Ringe Towers or what have you, right? I mean, how do you actually do that? I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not like there aren't people out there who aren't willing to speak and write and express themselves and do service for their community. People do it all the time. So it really, to me, the question here is how do you get, people like me, people like Mark Levy and Cambridge Day? How do you get people like Gerald Bergman, who could maybe want to come out of retirement and redo some version of an Area 4 newsletter again? The good people up at the Portis Grid Neighbors Association. I mean, a lot of these entities exist in little fragments of listservs and, sometimes moderated, sometimes not, sometimes angry, sometimes cordial, sometimes open to people joining mailing lists and sometimes being very exclusionary and not allowing people they don't like to be there. I know that personally, right? How do you orchestrate, the provision of public information in a way that's everybody can be kind of a little happy or a little pissed occasionally, but generally happy, because whatever we're doing now is just not good enough. It really isn't, you know. So anyway, we gotta do better. So I thought that was potentially one of the biggest items that grew out of, even though it was made subject of the charter right and is probably going to, be kicked around or kicked out the door in one form or another. But it's a conversation that really should happen, and I hope it does. We'll see. I mean, I've been doing what I do for over 25 years, and I'm going to continue to do that. And whether I'm part of some future collaboration or not, it doesn't really matter to me. I mean, I just do what I do because I like doing it. So anyway, by the way, I was very pleased, and the city manager on June 10th, he chose to chime in on this topic, which actually was a kind of a good move. And he pointed out that a long time ago, it turns out 100 years ago, Cambridge didn't just have a local paper of record. We had 5 seats, or at least 5 newspapers represented with assigned seats in the Cambridge City Council chambers back when they had merged the Board of Aldermen. It was under the Plan B charter. So in 1924, and I have the image, there were 4 people. One person actually covered for the Boston Globe and the Cambridge Chronicle, right? And it was the city manager who pointed this out, that we actually had 5 papers, and now we barely have any, right? And I asked him afterwards, where'd you get that? What are you in hitting the books? Where'd you find that out? And he told me, he says, got it from your site. I said, oh, thank you. Very happy to help. But I don't think we should be looking for 5 newspapers anytime soon. The Boston Globe occasionally does a Cambridge featured story, and they always will, I'm sure. But in terms of sort of the regular order of business, we need a little bit more than just the occasional bone thrown by some wayward reporter from the Boston Globe. Now, another big item, and I don't know really where this is going or what people's motivation are, but there was a tragedy that took place in several weeks ago in the form of a bicyclist fatality at the intersection of Mount Auburn Street and DeWolfe Street, on the sort of periphery of Harvard Square. And, whenever there's a bicycle fatality, there's always a lot of alarm, as well there should be. By the way, it was a 55-year-old woman from Florida who was riding one of the rental blue bikes, right? Who apparently was killed as a right turning truck going eastbound on Mount Auburn, taking a right down onto DeWolfe Street. There's a lot of nobody knows much more than that, even though I've seen in multiple places it expressed like what happened, and where they don't really know what happened. Could have been that a bicyclist was simply cruising ahead through a red bike light, while a truck had thought, I'm in the right here. I've got a right turn arrow, and I'm making my turn. And the bicyclists are told to, you got to stop. And maybe the bicyclist went through it, or maybe the bicyclist taken a turn simultaneous with the truck and got, caught, squeezed in there. I don't know. Nobody knows. It's in the hands of the district attorney, Marion Ryan. Sooner, hopefully sooner than later, we'll get a little bit more information about what actually happened. But what makes this interesting, and again, I deplore the practice of people capitalizing on a tragedy. It's happened before, certainly in the conversation about bicycle safety, that people will capitalize in ways that are sometimes fair, sometimes not so fair. So I think people should largely just shut up until they really understand what's happening here. But this was what makes this interesting. This is somewhat almost like from an academic point of view, is that Mount Auburn Street has fully implemented separated bike lanes. By fully, I mean with the flex posts, right? They're not up on the sidewalk or anything like that with concrete barriers, but they're in that section, at least, it had flex posts. And it actually had the bike lane, if you want to call it a lane, was actually split into two. There's the one, it's just the straight ahead half, and then there's the right turn half of that bike lane, right? And they're all, there's full signals, and DeWolfe Street, at least, is got a contraflow lane coming up from the river up toward Harvard, vicinity of Harvard Yard, and it's basically fully fitted out according to the requirements of the cycling safety ordinance, with appropriate signalizations and what have you. So what makes this an interesting conversation now is it's an example where arguably, and people are arguing because we do that here, this was already fully separated, and yet somebody died anyway, right? Now, again, you cannot eliminate the human factor in this. People make, good judgment, poor judgment. It's a shame when somebody has to die based on an error in judgment, if indeed it was an error in judgment, or if somebody died because of error in judgment of somebody else, on the part of somebody else, like a motor vehicle operator. But what happened actually, so there was, some of this it was ironic that this happened right around the time when I think it's third or fourth annual report on the progress of the cycling safety ordinance was actually arriving at the council simultaneously, which is quite the irony. But so in the council package for yesterday's meeting, there were 151 communications, the overwhelming majority of whom were it was basically form letter style, generated by one or several of the cycling advocacy groups, basically saying, well, we have to do more to really make these everything safer, and I'm thinking to myself, well, you already did that. So now they're basically upping the ante, saying, well, now we have to have specially designed intersections with specially designed this and that. In a way, it's kind of like moving the goalposts. And I'm not saying these might not be good improvements. They might be. But it's sort of like, rather than say, okay, somebody died, let's just accept it and learn from it, it was immediately translated into yet more advocacy, while you have to change more and more infrastructure. Now, I'm going to say something straight away as a person who was whose principal mode of transportation for most of the time I lived here was my bicycle. Not so much anymore, but I also drive. Um, I'm not a fan of some of the particular treatments City of Cambridge has actually done, especially around intersections. And I'll be very specific. And I think I would get a rather bicycle safety expert, John Allen, would probably agree with me on this one. It's standard practice if anybody's making a right turn that you should pull as your vehicle to as far to the right as you can prior to making the turn. Part of the reason for that is you do not want anybody passing you on the right. So if you can pull as close to the curb as possible so they can't even physically do that, all the better. I will tell you that I've been bending some of the traffic rules because the city's been putting in bike lanes to the right of right turn lanes for some time. And I have been consistently horrified by this. So I'll bend the rules and I'll pull as far right over into the bike lane because I do not want, for the sake of bicyclists, I do not want them imperiling themselves by being to the right of me. I'm not going to turn into them anyway, but you know, this notion now, what the city's philosophy seems to be is, oh, it's okay because we're just going to put in special traffic signals, and traffic signals will make everything perfect. Because after all, if you're going to be making a right turn, you will not be permitted to do that when the bicyclists have the green light to go forward. And the bicyclists will, of course, stop, religiously at their little red bicycle symbol to say stop if ever there's a green turn lane for a right turning vehicle, right? Signalization solves everything, doesn't it? Well, no, it doesn't. I'm not the only one who, after this fatality, took a walk down there to that intersection of DeWolfe and Mount Auburn and just did some quick counts. 75% from the several times that I've been there, 75% at least of the cyclists go right through the red bicycle signal. Now, maybe it's just not, maybe it's too subtle. Or maybe if you're a woman from Florida who's not familiar with Cambridge's PhD required traffic signalization scheme, maybe you just didn't quite understand what was up there. Or maybe if you saw the green arrow for the vehicle, maybe you thought, well, I guess I can turn right here as well, even though there's a separate way for bicyclists to be doing that. It's too damn complicated. Rule number one for traffic engineering is that it has to be instantly understandable by a 7-year-old within 2 seconds, really, because people coming from everywhere, you can't study the intersection as you approach it. It's just ridiculous. So I am not a fan of some of the standards and practices that have been implemented by the city. Okay. And again, I'm passing no judgment on who's at fault in this situation here at all. I'm just saying I just generally don't like it. Now, my fear is that the city will say, well, we're just going to have to make everything even more difficult for all motor vehicles, and that seems to sort of be part of the city's plan anyway. I mean, I jokingly sometimes refer to the Department of Traffic, Parking and Transportation as things like the Department of Congestion, Obstruction, and Misery, because they just make it difficult. And maybe ultimately they simply want everybody who drives a motor vehicle to just stop driving motor vehicles. You could certainly draw that conclusion from what you see on a lot of these streets. So anyway, I don't necessarily want to go on and on and on about this here, but what I would say as a last word on this is that put not thy faith in signalization and reconfiguration of roadways, because we're still talking about human beings and human beings who have to make snap judgments and human beings who don't always follow every rule. And your road system has to be simple enough that it doesn't require a PhD in traffic engineering to proceed through the intersection. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Now, another thing which is coming up very soon, sort of, is meeting number 2 of the post-charter review committee world. So on June 5th, I believe it was, there was a meeting of the Government Operations Committee taking up the matter of what, if any, changes should be made to the Cambridge City Charter pursuant to the report and recommendations that came out of the Charter Review Committee that met for a year and a half or so, I guess a year and a half, up and issued its report in late January. Now, I've made no secret of the fact that I don't like most of the recommendations, but there are some that I do like. Bottom line for me is give the Election Commission a little bit more flexibility for the elections so that we can actually do a proper way of doing the proportional representation account that's not dependent on the order of the ballots. It's a very simple, minor technical fix. Requires the removal, the addition of have a hashtag in the code. That's it. It's easy, very easy. So I would call that a minor modification that gives us more flexibility. The general reformatting of the charter is itself a good thing too. All right. Now, I've talked how much I sort of like the idea of something akin to citizen assemblies that they've talked about. But at this point, I think it's the recommendations to the committee I do not agree with. And I think it's too big a conversation for this city council to really take up right now. So this is a can maybe that should be kicked down the road for future discussion, right? City council has, and by the way, at the June 5th meeting, there was some very, very good information provided from the law department, election commission, and others that made it clear that some of the more problematic recommendations like non-citizen voting, changing from odd year elections to even year elections, allowing 16-year-olds to vote in municipal elections, that these could very well be poison pills that will make the legislature say, go screw, But also there are some, and I hadn't realized this, there may actually be some jeopardy for people who may one day seek citizenship if indeed they were to vote based on this, in terms of state, federal laws and what have you. Anyway, I'm not going to claim any great expertise in it, but I think it kind of opened the eyes of a few city councilors at least, so that maybe those councilors might be a little bit more amenable to a simpler, more modest change to the charter rather than trying to do, create revolution. One of the concerns I have, and again, I'll stand by this, is that I think in the formation of the Charter Review Committee itself, there were some city councilors who were playing marionette strings in order to try and promote certain outcomes. Things like, strong mayor, moving from city manager to strong mayor, or having directly elected mayor as opposed to the system we have now, which is essentially where the city council elects the city council president, who we call the mayor, who has that little extra responsibility of also being chair of the school committee. But, in Cambridge, the mayor isn't like a mayor you think of in other places. The city manager is the chief executive, which I think is a system that has proven itself very, very, very well over the 80 years that we've been using that system. So, but I do think that there were at least some city councilors who were hopeful that this whole charter review process might give them kind of a way to kind of be mayor, popularly elected mayor, or a mayor for life, right? So that's not what charter review or charter reform should be about. It should never be about assisting the political aspirations of any individual councilor or future councilor. So anyway, there's a meeting coming up, part 2, on June, I believe it's June 25th, right? I'm just going to double check here. Yeah, June 25th at 11 a.m. Government Operations Rules and Claims Committee to continue the June 5th discussion on charter review recommendations, develop draft recommendations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where this is going, it's a little unclear. Doesn't look like it has enthusiastic support to do anything radical, which I think is good, but who knows, and who knows? I mean, I think only 2 of us showed up to speak at the meeting on June 5th. So I don't know, will a crowd of people, revolutionaries, all show up and say, down with the evil city manager system or whatever? I don't know. We'll see. But it's a conversation that is proceeding, and as well it should. Now, there's one other item, kind of a news item on the civic front. I had meant to mention it 2 weeks ago when we last did these programs, but I didn't. And I'm not super well informed about this particular topic, by the way. But, I have this luxury of not having to follow the Cambridge Public Schools conversations. I don't go to school committee meetings. Occasionally, the Harvard Crimson will drop a little article in there saying something or other. Or I'll ask a counselor or a school committee member who, I know a few of them, what's going on, right? But I don't really follow it that closely. But, there was a news item a couple of months ago now where it wasn't meant for public consumption, where it was that School Superintendent Victoria Greer was asked to submit her resignation. Now, that wasn't meant to be public, so they just kind of shut up about it, but it was out there. And then eventually, I think in late May, they had a meeting and they made it official that they were asking her to submit her resignation, which I guess is happening. And that went on a 5-2 vote, with the dissenting votes being Mayor Simmons and School Committeeman Richard Harding. Now, you can read into that anything you want here. I think it's fair to say that there was consensus for whatever reason. I don't know. I pass no judgment in this one, that Victoria Greer was no longer the person for the job, and maybe wasn't ever really the person for the job, and maybe they made a mistake. And again, I'm not being critical of her here, but so it was a 5-2 vote. What's the meaning of that? I don't know for sure. But one thing, I mean, I wanted to understand this a little bit better, so I did ask around a little bit, like, well, why would you, if you're going to be kicking out the school superintendent, what was the alternate point of view? It's not necessarily because you're an enthusiastic supporter of the current superintendent. Truth of the matter is, Victoria Greer had another full year on her contract. So the question is, when you basically give her walking papers, you then have to sign off on a settlement of some sort, basically a severance package, where you basically have to pay a considerable sum of money to a superintendent, while you then go into a search, lickety-split, a search, to come up with, first an interim superintendent, presumably, and then a permanent replacement, who you will then have to pay as well. So there is at least some logic in saying, well, why don't we just keep the superintendent until the end of the contract term, and basically just, as the expression is often used these days, put some guardrails around the remainder of the contract period, so that the superintendent does not use any authority that a superintendent has to do things school committee seriously doesn't want to have happen. But because they could always fire in an instant then anyway, right? If that were to happen. So I actually think there was some good reasons on the part of all members of the school committee to vote the way they did, including the 2 who chose not to end the contract right now, right here, right now. Now, what's going to happen? I don't know. I'm just going to speak selfishly here. Selfishly, I teach mathematics, and I think Cambridge Public Schools can do lots of good things or very bad things, but as long as they're teaching good mathematics education at all levels, and encouraging students to aspire to great things, including mathematics, and things that you can learn, you can do because you can do the mathematics, then I'm going to be happy. All the other stuff to me is just gravy. It doesn't matter much at all. So, I'm very, very specific about that. So anyway, we'll say too much more on that, but maybe just in the last couple of minutes, I'll just say a couple of other things. So um, the conversation, debate, plans, I don't know what you want to call it, about Central Square are ongoing. There seems to be some intention coming out of Community Development Department, and in conjunction with some city councilors, that they want to rezone Central Square for considerably larger buildings. And this is also happening simultaneously with what they call the Central Square Lot Study, which is really part of the municipal facilities plan. What are you going to do with the parking lots? Are they going to remain parking lots? What are you going to do? You're going to move the library. You're going to reconfigure the Green Street garage and replace it with housing and maybe with something else underneath it, or a different parking garage. What's up? Anyway, that's a conversation that will likely continue through the summer into the fall and maybe even into early next year. So keep it on your radar. I think it's an important conversation. I will mention, however, that it was interesting at last night's city council meeting, there was a late order filed really on behalf of residents of the Manning Apartments, which is really Cambridge Housing Authority apartments there, who are not, at least the people who were there speaking, were not particularly enamored of this notion that a mega-sized project was going to happen, and that maybe the library space that they like having there might go away as in addition. So there's another collection of voices, primarily older voices, who are now a part of this conversation. So anyway, we'll see where this is going. I'm certainly going to be paying very close attention to that one as we head into the fall. So anyway, we're just about out of time here, so I'm going to sign off for now, but I'll see you in a couple of weeks again on Cambridge Inside Out.